If you're a manual worker, the law says you have to be paid your wages every week.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
And so if you're paid bi-weekly, it means that every other week's pay is late, and you're entitled to compensation for that.
La Bacaneria Show, de lunes a viernes.
Oye, claro que sí, la bacanería del mediodía está aquí en Latino Mixx y lo prometido es deuda. Tenemos aquí nuevamente a nuestro abogado Pete Romero, and it's very nice to see you again after a couple months, right?
It's been a few months,
Few
but
months.
it's really good to be back here. It's like home.
You look the same.
Thank you.
Nothing
That's
has
very
changed.
kind of you.
Right?
Yeah. I'm older.
You older? Well, you look the same. You look the same.
Thank
So
you.
I'm glad to see you again. We used to love when you used to come here because we used to talk about, abusing at work and all that stuff. And it was very interesting to learn a little bit about that because I know a lot of people go through that stuff, but a lot of people doesn't know what to do.
That's right. I think there are a lot of workers who do not know their rights. They're just not aware that the law protects them from certain abuses.
Yes, and then we let that stuff happen and we get abused and then we don't know what to do. And that's what we have Pete Romero today en La Bacaneria Show. Señores, pongan atención, nuestro abogado Pete Romero el día de hoy aquí hablándonos sobre nuestros derechos como empleados. So, we say it in Spanish, al grano. Direct to the point,
Sure.
Because we don't want to waste any time. We want to hear a lot about, what are our rights, and learn a little bit.
Sure.
Okay. So my first question is: if an undocumented worker entitled to protection under the wage laws?
The answer to that is absolutely yes.
Okay.
An employee is entitled to their wages regardless of their immigration status. And if they haven't been paid their wages properly and timely, they absolutely have the right to bring a lawsuit and recover their wages in court, regardless of whether they're documented, not documented.
So that's very important to know because usted que me está escuchando, si usted tiene o no tiene documentos, no importa. Usted tiene los mismos derechos que cualquier persona. I'm just saying in Spanish so people,
Sure.
Also understand. Doesn't matter if you have or don't have any documents, you have the same rights, right?
That is correct.
I like that. Next question. What if a worker does not have records because they were paid in cash or didn't write it down the hours? What happened in that case? Because that happens a lot. I get paid cash, I didn't write my hours, and then, you get problems.
Right. I hear that from employees frequently. They say, well, I regularly worked more than 40 hours in a work week, but I don't have records to prove it. How do I prove it? I tell them, don't worry. The obligation is on the employer. The law is very strict and requires the employer to keep very, very accurate records of the hours that are worked and the wages that are paid. So even if you're paid in cash, the employer is required to keep accurate records of the cash that was paid and the hours that you worked, the time that you started work each day, the time that you finished work each day. That obligation is not the employee's obligation. So I tell people, don't worry, leave it to us. We'll help you get the compensation.
So they will be able to prove that case in case they get paid in cash and they have no proof.
Absolutely. Happens all the time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of Latinos, especially, they work cash, because of the situation. But then, you get those cases where your boss doesn't want to pay you what it is or, pay you the amount of hours that you work. And because you get cash,
That's right. That's right. But we're here to help. And don't worry if you have records, you don't have records. It's the employer's obligation. Yep.
That's good to hear. Now, what are some ways in which the employees or the workers escape when they want to pay you? What did they do?
Yeah. So how a worker's cheated out of their wages.
How they cheat.
Yeah, happens a lot. So what we see a lot of, if Andrea, that if you work more than 40 hours in a work week, you're entitled to time and a half, right? You have to be paid additional compensation. You can't just be paid your regular rate for hours worked after 40. So some businesses have multiple locations, and what they'll do is they'll have an employee work at 2 or 3 different locations, and between the 2 or 3 locations, they go over 40 hours. But they pay them at their regular rate by issuing separate checks from each location rather than paying time and a half, which is, that can be unlawful. That's one of the ways. in which workers are cheated out of their overtime pay.
Oh, wow. Look at that, So that's the way they cheat and they don't want to pay you, what you deserve. There's always a way, And when it's about cheating, the people will always find a way. But that's also why we have you here. So you can explain people, how that works.
Right. And well, you know what else happens? Sometimes companies say, okay, we're not going to pay you for lunch, right? You're going to have a meal period, a lunch break, and we're not going to pay you for that period. And that's fine. That's lawful.
Okay.
But very often they'll automatically deduct the time and the employee may not be taking that break. Maybe they don't get an uninterrupted break. Maybe the company is too busy and the supervisor says, no, you can't take a break. You need to keep working. But in the meantime, they deduct that time from their pay. That's another way that employees get cheated out of their wages.
Oh, bien interesante. Así que mi gente, usted que me está escuchando, escuche porque esto puede ser que a usted le convenga, que usted tenga un trabajo donde le esté pasando, no se deje engañar. Now, I have this question and I know a lot of people, sometimes they don't understand. What about travel time to and from the work site? Because a lot of people, let's say they work cleaning houses. And they go from one house to other house to point A to point B, but they don't get paid that time. Is that legal or no?
So if it's travel within the workday,
okay,
during working hours from location to location, that time has to be paid. That has to be compensated.
Like, let's say landscaping. They do landscaping in one house and then go to the other house. From that house to the other house, they have to get paid.
That is correct.
Okay.
Right.
But not, let's say, from the house to the work.
That is also correct. You're very smart. I might hire you. You might need a job at my law office.
I might need an extra job. You know what? I need extra money. So explain a little bit about that so people can understand.
So let me give you another example. So let's say you leave your house and you go to a factory every day. Obviously, you don't get paid for your drive time from your house to the factory where you work, or the time that you drive home. But let's say that you do construction or landscaping, and you drive from the employer's yard or shop where they keep all their tools and equipment and trucks. And let's say the shop is on Long Island and the work site where you're actually doing the construction is in New York City, right? So the employee goes to the yard. They have to load up tools onto the truck. They need to get equipment. They need to get material, maybe cement, maybe sand, etc. They spend time loading the truck. They get in the truck. They drive maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours in traffic to New York City. There are some employers that don't pay for that.
Oh, and that if you add it, then it's 3, 4, 5 hours a day that you waste driving, and then you don't get paid.
That is correct. And in that situation, you're required to be compensated for your time spent driving to the city and back.
Oiga, mi gente, usted que me está escuchando ya lo sabe. Si usted de esos que trabaja en construcción, landscaping, cleaning houses, y un trabajo donde le toque manejar de punto A a punto B, de casa a casa, o de, bueno, no sé, tienen que pagarle ese tiempo porque es su tiempo. Because if they don't pay that time, that means your day of work is going to end up like 5 hours a day. So that's nothing.
It could be 4 or 5 hours of travel, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the week, you're talking about 20, 25 hours of unpaid time, right?
That's a lot of money right there. Oh,
yeah.
And I'm pretty sure a lot of people do that. Oh, I'm not going to pay you because that was time that you were driving.
Exactly. And that's wrong. That's unlawful. So if that's happening to you, call our office.
Call Pete Romero if that's happening to you. Now, this is another common question. It is okay for my employer to pay me my wages every 2 weeks, my paycheck every 2 weeks? Because I see a lot of companies, they do it. They pay every 2 weeks, other ones every week. How that works?
So the answer to that question depends on what type of work you do.
Okay.
But if you're doing any kind of work what we call manual work, okay? So if you're standing all day, if you're lifting things, if you're carrying things, if you're bending and sweeping and mopping, any kind of physical work. Okay? If you're a manual worker, the law says you have to be paid your wages every week. Right?
Okay.
And so if you're paid bi-weekly, it means that every other week's pay is late, and you're entitled to compensation for that.
Oh, sé que lo están escuchando. Si usted hace trabajo manual, todo lo que tenga que ver, donde se tenga que levantar cosas, moverse, tienen que pagarle semanal. So, what happens if they don't pay you every week? If they pay you every 2 weeks, is that illegal?
Yes, that's unlawful. And you have the right to compensation for every week that was paid late, which is essentially every other week.
What about the restaurant's employees?
So yeah, I would say who are manual workers, right? I would say people who work in restaurants, washing dishes, cooking food, preparing food, waiters, waitresses who are on their feet, people who work in factories, machine operators, people who package materials in factories, obviously construction workers, landscapers, cable technicians.
Okay.
If you work in a pharmaceutical factory, you might be a manual worker, so long as you're doing things that are physical in nature. You know, you're standing for long periods of time. You have to lift things. You have to carry things. You have to bend. You have to climb.
Now, I'm going to put myself as an example. You know, they pay me, you know, by the law here. But what about my job or everybody else's job here? Was that, you know, like, is that weekly or is not weekly?
So I would say that that's probably not, your job is probably not what we would call a manual worker.
So if they pay me every 2 weeks, will be okay?
It would be okay.
Okay.
So
I get paid every week, but, you know, I'm just asking because so people can understand.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm happy to make that clear. So if you work, for instance, in an office.
But my boss can hear that. If not, I'm going to get paid every 2 weeks.
If you're doing clerical work, right?
Okay.
You know, computer work with paper, then you're not a manual worker, and it's okay if you're paid every 2 weeks.
Okay, very interesting. Now, also, if it's a big company, also, I think that's how it works. Like, if it's a huge company, you're supposed to get paid every week, or no? It doesn't matter.
Doesn't really matter about the size of the company. No. And what really matters is the type of work that you're doing. Are you doing things that require physical tasks, or are you doing things that are clerical in nature, or that's the difference.
That's the difference. Okay, very interesting. Now let's talk about, you know, we talk about a little bit about restaurants, but let's talk about the tipping with the employees. That's where, like, I see a lot unfair things when you work in, let's say, at the restaurant, at a beauty salon, or any type of job where you get tips. How that works? What's the right thing to do? What the laws cover, you know, with that type of case?
Right. So you know that every employee has to be paid at least the minimum wage, right?
Okay.
New York State sets the minimum wage, and here on Long Island, the minimum wage rate is currently $15 per hour. That's what you have to be paid. If you're a tipped employee, the law allows the employer to pay you less than the minimum wage, right? Say $10 an hour, with the idea that you're going to make $5 an hour in tips. But what happens if it's slow? Let's say you work in a restaurant and you don't have a lot of business and you're not making $5.
You know, that happens to me years ago. I used to get paid very little. Oh, but you made tips.
Yeah.
So I was getting paid less than the minimum, you know, but sometimes I don't make the same tips every day. I made less or nothing, you know, it depends how busy it is.
That's right. And there are a lot of, so right from the beginning, if the employer is going to pay you less than minimum wage because you're receiving tips, they have to give you written notice.
Okay.
Right? They have to give you a document that says, we're going to pay you less than the minimum wage because you're receiving tips. And you have to sign that notice.
Oh.
So a lot of employers don't do that.
Oh, no.
Right?
No, that doesn't happen.
That's number one. Number two is, so what happens if you're in a restaurant and there's no business for whatever reason, there's a snowstorm, no one's coming in, you're not making tips, and the employer is still paying you that tipped rate of less than minimum wage, the employer has to make up the difference. They have to make up the difference between the tipped rate of $10 an hour and $15 an hour, which is minimum wage.
Oh, wow. And I don't think that ever happened. Like, I don't, they just like, oh, it's low day. Okay, sorry for you.
It often doesn't happen. And you know what another problem is? Employers will pay somebody the tipped rate for non-tipped work. So they'll take somebody who, you know, they'll pay somebody the tipped rate of $10 an hour with the idea that they're supposed to receive tips, but then they say, well, go outside and clean up the
They
parking
put
lot.
you to do some other stuff.
Go
you
do
know?
landscaping in the parking lot. Go clean the bathroom. Hey, the dishwasher didn't show up to work. Go wash the dishes, right? But you're not receiving tips if you're washing dishes.
Exactly.
That's,
That happens to me. If there
that's-
was no work, I had to be cleaning and doing other stuff because it was slow.
Right.
But I never get paid extra or anything like the difference.
Right. Or they'll make you come in an hour before there are customers to do work, set up,
Yes.
take the chairs off the tables, fill
And they
all-
had to pay you that.
Yeah, they have to pay you. They have to pay you the minimum wage.
Oh, wow. Mire, mi gente, usted que está escuchando, es muy importante que usted sepa esto porque así de ahorita en ahorita nos va robando. You know, from hour to hour, you get stole money. And nowadays, listen, you know, everything is expensive. You need to make you money. And, if that happens every week, you make them mad. There's a lot of money that you're losing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And the other way that, employees get cheated out of their wages, because tips are wages. right?
Exactly.
They're
I was
part of
going to
your
ask
pay.
you that. What's another way they can cheat out the pay, you know?
When a manager receives part of your tips.
Oh, my God.
That is a big no-no.
I always have that question, you know, how do they buy those tips? How do they do it? Especially
Yeah.
when they put it in a jar or
Right.
like,
We call that a tip pool, right? All the tips are pooled together, right? And the people who are serving, the servers, the waitresses, the busboys, bartenders, they're the people who are supposed to receive the tips. And it should be shared with them. Sometimes what happens is the manager, the maitre d', sometimes even the owner says, I want part of those tips. That is stealing your wages. That's stealing
sad.
your wages.
That's sad because why
That is
would the
unlawful.
owner will get part of the tips, you know? Like, come on.
I know. It's really, it's wrong. It's just so wrong, and it's unlawful. And if it's happening to you, call our law office
Call
because
Peter
we're
Romero.
happy to help you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I have one last question.
Sure.
Because I know people, they say, okay, all this sounds great, fantastic. I know, the law will defend me. I have the rights, blah, 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 blah. But can a worker be fired or suspended for making a wage claim? Because they get scared. I'll be like, you know what? I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to get fired.
Sure. They do have that fear, and I understand that fear, but I tell my clients all the time that if that happens to you, if an employer fires you because you made a wage claim, that is against the law, and it's unlawful to retaliate against an employee who has complained about wages, and that's a separate claim for damages. You'd be entitled to compensation if you're fired because you complained about wages.
So you can't get fired. Así que mi gente, ya lo escuchó. Y si usted quiere seguir escuchando más sobre esto que está súper interesante, recuerde que vamos a tener aquí más a seguido a Peter Romero. Peter, where can people can call you or contact you in case they're going through this situation?
Yeah, sure. Our number is 631
Okay.
257-5588. 631-257-5588. And my staff speaks Spanish.
Perfect.
Okay. And I would say maybe 80 to 90% of our clients are Spanish speaking. We're here to help you.
Thank you so much, Peter Romero. Muchísimas gracias. Ya lo sabe, habla en español. Llámelo, contáctelo si usted está siendo abusado en el trabajo. Llame a Peter Romero. Thank you so much for coming. It's nice to see you again. It's been a
wonderful to be
long
here.
time. We are friends now. Así que thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.